Last time, we looked at how a hypothetical company we're calling the Sovereign Industrial Atoll might pay its workers a high salary on paper, clawed back through mandatory deductions until almost nothing was left. But getting paid is only half the equation. The other half is what you're actually allowed to spend that money on. And history has an even older answer for that problem than Rome does. It's the economic engine behind the largest empire the world has ever seen. Here's the mechanic. On the atoll, residents and the companies operating there are legally prohibited from producing their own tools, their own food, their own equipment. Everything has to be imported through one channel, one owner. Picture a single trade route, a river, a shipping lane running in only one direction at a time. Raw materials, minerals, data, whatever the atoll extracts flow inward to a central processing hub. Finished goods, manufactured equipment, processed information flow back out to the very people the raw materials came from. Priced, however, the owner of that hub decides. The atoll doesn't just own the workers' paychecks. It owns the inputs, the manufacturing, and the market, all three links of the same chain. Britain ran this exact system for over a century and gave it a name, mercantilism. Starting in 1651, a series of laws called the Navigation Acts required that valuable colonial exports, tobacco, sugar, cotton, indigo, could only be shipped to Britain or through British ports on British ships. In exchange, the colonies were required to buy their manufactured goods from Britain. That was the whole loop. Raw materials out, finished goods back in, and Britain controlling the price on both ends. But the Navigation Acts weren't even the most direct version of this. In 1732, Parliament passed the Hat Act, banning colonial hat makers from exporting their own hats. In 1750, the Iron Act restricted the colonies from building new mills to manufacture their own finished iron goods. These weren't accidents of trade policy. They were deliberate laws designed to make sure the colonies stayed customers, never competitors. The most extreme version of this same playbook happened in India. Before British rule, India wasn't a raw material economy. It was the workshop of the world, producing, by some estimates, a quarter of all global industrial output, most of it in textiles. Then, colonial policy inverted it. The East India Company enforced exclusive supply contracts directly on weavers, in some cases backed by military force, guaranteeing that raw cotton and silk flowed to company hands at prices the company itself dictated. Then, tariffs were rewritten so raw cotton could leave India for Britain almost duty-free, while finished Indian cloth faced steep tariffs trying to enter British markets, and cheap machine-made British cloth flooded back into India instead. Between 1800 and 1860 alone, India's textile exports collapsed by 98%, while textile imports from Britain increased by more than 6,000%. Millions of weavers lost their livelihoods and were pushed into farming cash crops like cotton and indigo instead of food, a shift that contributed to famines that killed people by the millions in the decades that followed. India supplied the raw material. Britain owned the processing, and Britain sold the finished product back to the very population that grew the cotton in the first place. None of this requires ships or empires anymore. It's happening again, right now, just with a different raw material. Researchers now use the term data colonialism to describe how technology companies extract enormous value from user data generated in developing countries. Information harvested for free, processed on servers thousands of miles away, and sold back as targeted advertising, algorithmic predictions, or the training data behind entire AI models. A newer, more physical version of this, sometimes called compute colonialism, is unfolding through 2026 as tech companies negotiate land and tax breaks to build data centers in developing nations, consuming enormous amounts of local electricity and water, while the actual intelligence and the actual profit flows back to a small handful of companies headquartered somewhere else entirely. As recently as March of this year, countries including Brazil and South Africa pushed at the World Trade Organization to end a long-standing tax exemption on digital data transfers, arguing it lets wealthy nations extract data value from poorer ones without ever paying for it. It's the same three-part loop as 1750 or 1830. Only the input changed. Instead of cotton, it's clicks. So why call this coercive instead of just a well-run supply chain? Because a normal market gives you a choice. If one supplier overcharges you, you buy from someone else, or you make it yourself. A closed loop removes both options by law. When the same entity extracts your raw material, owns the only factory that can process it, and runs the only stores that sells it back, the price isn't set by competition anymore. It's set by whoever owns the loop. Colonial India couldn't just start weaving its own cloth again once British tariffs made it unprofitable, because British law and British capital had already made sure there was no competing option left standing. That's not commerce. That's a closed system with the exits removed, and it's why every real version of it, mercantilism, colonial India, and whatever comes out of the current fight over who owns the world's data, has eventually provoked the same response: resistance, regulation, or rebellion. The Sovereign Industrial Atoll doesn't need to invent a new form of control. It just needs to run the oldest one in the history books, at a smaller scale, with better branding.